On the evening of April 12, 2003, Richard Palmer's life was tragically cut short in what would later be revealed as a heinous act of violence. The 52-year-old freelance photographer was found murdered at his home in Floyd County, Virginia. His body was discovered by his daughter, who arrived at the residence after Palmer failed to answer repeated calls. He was found inside his Chevrolet pickup truck, parked near a recreational area in Perry Park on 12.5 Street Southwest, Roanoke. Slumped in the driver's seat, with his loyal red Australian heeler, Rufus, lying lifeless beside him, the scene suggested far more than a sudden medical emergency or accidental tragedy. The crime scene was chilling, with signs of a violent struggle and an apparent execution-style killing. Palmer's death sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community, leaving everyone who knew him grappling with the shocking loss. Richard "Dickie" Palmer wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, but in the Roanoke and Floyd County communities, his presence was impossible to miss. Born in the early 1950s in Roanoke, Virginia, Palmer was raised in a modest, close-knit household steeped in Southern values: kindness, hard work, and community. From an early age, Palmer was known for his quiet curiosity and love for observing the world around him. He attended local schools in Roanoke, where he was a well-liked student with a thoughtful demeanor. While he wasn't the most outspoken kid in class, he had a creative spark that set him apart. After completing his primary and secondary education, Palmer pursued photography, a passion that would shape his professional life and leave a lasting mark on the region. He studied photography at a time when the craft still demanded hours in the darkroom, careful attention to light, and a keen sense of composition. While records about his formal education in photography are limited, colleagues and friends confirm that he trained extensively in both photojournalism and freelance work, building a portfolio that soon opened doors at the Roanoke Times, where he eventually became a staff photographer. Palmer was part of a generation that valued storytelling through images. His photographs were not flashy or sensational. They were honest, capturing small-town moments with care and authenticity. He covered everything from local high school football games and community events to nature scenes and quiet human interest stories. His style was subtle but intentional, and his ability to find beauty in everyday life made his work memorable. Outside his professional world, Palmer led a life rooted in simplicity and sincerity. He was a devoted father to his daughter, and maintained a close relationship with his family in Floyd County. His love for animals, especially his dog Rufus, was one of the most well-known aspects of his personal life. The two were virtually inseparable, whether on photography assignments, hiking through rural trails, or sitting quietly at home. Palmer's friends described him as dependable, humble, and always ready to lend an ear. He had a dry sense of humor and a way of making people feel comfortable around him. He never boasted about his accomplishments. Instead, he lived a life of integrity and gentleness, letting his actions and his photographs speak for him. He wasn't wealthy, but he was rich in friendships, in character, and in purpose. His home in Renner, a quiet rural part of Floyd County, reflected his lifestyle: modest, peaceful, and filled with the things he loved: books, camera gear, and photos from his many years behind the lens. He enjoyed being outdoors, capturing the rolling hills and winding backroads of Virginia, and always preferred the sound of nature to city noise. To those who knew him, Palmer was more than just a photographer. He was a fixture in the community, a familiar face at local events, a kind presence who showed up when it mattered, and a storyteller who captured the soul of his hometown through every click of the shutter. The investigation into his death began almost immediately, but it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary case. At first, police were unable to find any immediate suspects, and the motive for the killing remained unclear. As time passed, the case grew colder, and investigators were left with more questions than answers. For years, the case would remain unsolved, and Palmer's family and friends were left in the dark, desperate for justice. Despite the initial lack of progress, Palmer's death was not forgotten. His friends and family continued to press for answers, and the case remained open, even as the years slipped by. The photograph of Palmer that was most often shared by his family and friends captured the essence of the man he was: a quiet, humble, and dedicated father. His loved ones held on to the hope that the truth would eventually emerge, even if it took years. In the months and years that followed Palmer's death, investigators faced numerous challenges in their quest for answers. The case quickly became a complex web of conflicting leads, dead ends, and misleading information. Palmer had few known enemies, and no one could understand why someone would want to harm him. His lifestyle was simple and peaceful, marked by his devotion to his family and his work as a freelance photographer. The investigation centered around a few theories, including the possibility of a robbery gone wrong or a personal vendetta. However, as time wore on, law enforcement officials struggled to make headway. There were some early leads, but none that could conclusively link anyone to the crime. Detectives combed through Palmer's personal and professional life, hoping that something would surface that would point them in the right direction. One of the few significant pieces of evidence was Palmer's camera, which was found at the scene of the crime. However, it didn't provide any answers. Investigators also looked into the possibility that Palmer had been involved in some sort of underground activity, but nothing emerged to suggest that he was leading a double life. For Palmer's family, the years of silence from law enforcement were excruciating. The sense of helplessness that permeated the investigation was compounded by the fact that the man they had loved and cherished was no longer with them, and yet his killer remained unidentified. With no DNA matches and little forensic evidence, the case stalled. Over time, the file was moved to the cold case shelves. But for Palmer's family, especially his daughter and extended relatives, his memory was far from cold. They kept his story alive, appealing to the public year after year, desperate for answers. "I never gave up hope," one family member would later say. "Somewhere, someone knew something. And Dickie deserved justice." In 2025, more than 2 decades after Palmer's death, a breakthrough came. Through advancements in DNA technology and the continued efforts of the Cold Case Unit, law enforcement was able to make a crucial discovery. Using DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, investigators were able to match the genetic material to a suspect who had been living in the region under a false identity for years. The suspect, later identified as an individual with a history of violent offenses, was arrested and charged with Palmer's murder. The news sent shockwaves through the community, as many had long since assumed that the case would remain unsolved. However, the discovery of the killer's identity brought both relief and a deep sense of sorrow to Palmer's family. While they had waited years for answers, the revelation that their loved one had been murdered in such a brutal manner was a heavy blow. The arrest also raised questions about the investigation itself. Some wondered why it had taken so long for the DNA match to be made, and others criticized the early handling of the case. Regardless, the identification of the killer offered the Palmer family the chance to finally face the man responsible for their loved one's death. After the arrest, the trial process began. Throughout the trial, Palmer's family remained steadfast in their pursuit of justice. They were determined to ensure that the man who had taken Richard's life would be held accountable for his actions. The trial revealed new details about the motive for Palmer's murder, shedding light on the events that led up to the fateful night. Evidence presented in court suggested that the killer had targeted Palmer not for any personal grievance, but as part of a broader pattern of violent behavior. The suspect had a history of criminal activity, and it was eventually revealed that Palmer's murder was part of a spree of violence that had spanned several years. Palmer had, unknowingly, crossed paths with the killer at a local event, which may have been what led to his tragic fate. During the trial, the Palmer family's anguish was palpable. They recounted memories of Richard as a loving father, a kind-hearted friend, and a devoted community member. For them, the trial was not only about seeking justice for Richard, but also about honoring the memory of the man they had lost. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the defendant had shown no remorse for his actions. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and in January 2025, nearly 22 years after Palmer's death, a Floyd County grand jury handed down 4 felony indictments. The man charged was Milton Lewis Wright, 62 years old, an individual known to law enforcement, already incarcerated at Deerfield Correctional Center on unrelated charges. His scheduled release was only 5 years away, in 2030. But now, a much darker past had come to light. The charges against Wright were steep. First-degree murder, use of a firearm in the commission of a felony, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and felony animal cruelty. For the first time in decades, the Palmer family had a name, a face, and a thread to pull. But who was Milton Wright? And why would he kill Dickie Palmer? Information about Milton Wright remained limited, as investigators and prosecutors remained cautious during the early stages of prosecution. What is known is that Wright was no stranger to law enforcement. He had a criminal history, including weapons charges, and had served multiple stints in state facilities. But his connection to Palmer was unclear, until investigators began piecing together testimony and forensic evidence long left dormant. Authorities have not disclosed the precise motive behind the murder. However, sources close to the investigation suggested that Palmer and Wright may have had a personal dispute, possibly over a private matter that escalated fatally. Some speculated it may have involved a financial disagreement or unresolved bad blood. What ultimately cracked the case after 2 decades? According to Virginia State Police, it was a combination of revisited evidence, new witness interviews, and modern forensic tools unavailable in 2003. But perhaps more importantly, it was the power of collaboration. Agencies including the Virginia State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigations Salem Field Office, the Floyd County Sheriff's Office, the Roanoke Police Department, and even the Texas Department of Public Safety's Texas Ranger Division worked together to re-examine every detail of the case. In recent years, cold case divisions across the country have found success applying new technology to old files, and Palmer's case was no exception. Senior Special Agent Douglas R. Hubert, who oversaw the case in its later years, credited the cooperative spirit of law enforcement as a driving force in the breakthrough. "We never stopped working this case," Hubert said. But having multiple agencies review it with fresh eyes and new tools was what finally led us to Milton Wright. Milton Wright now faces trial in Floyd County. Prosecutors have indicated they will pursue the harshest penalties available. Though no trial date has been announced, the legal process is expected to begin later in 2025. As the case heads to court, new details may emerge about the events of April 2003, details that until now have been buried in silence. For those who knew Richard, his loss was deeply felt. His absence left a void in the hearts of his family, friends, and colleagues. But despite the pain, the community also found solace in knowing that justice had finally been served. Palmer's photographs, which had once captured the everyday beauty of rural Virginia, now served as a poignant reminder of the life he had lived and the legacy he had left behind. In the years since Palmer's death, the case has served as a symbol of resilience. The investigation, though flawed and delayed, ultimately resulted in the closure that Palmer's family had longed for. And while no verdict could ever bring Palmer back, the pursuit of justice has allowed his memory to live on in the hearts of those who knew and loved him. Maryanne Daniels came into the world on a summer day in 1955, born into a modest family in Snohomish County, Washington. She was the second youngest of 4 siblings in a home where laughter often rang louder than hardship. Her parents, blue-collar workers with deep roots in the community, were committed to raising their children with values of kindness, faith, and resilience. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest during the 1960s, Maryanne was a product of a generation navigating change. Despite physical disabilities that began affecting her motor functions early in childhood, Maryanne maintained an infectious optimism. Her family recalled how she'd insist on participating in neighborhood games, never allowing her limitations to define her. As a young girl, Maryanne attended elementary school in Everett, where she was enrolled in both mainstream and special education programs, designed to support her needs without excluding her from a typical childhood experience. Teachers described her as sweet, soft-spoken, and curious, and she often spent hours drawing, reading picture books, or writing short poems about animals. By the time she reached middle school, Maryanne's physical challenges had become more pronounced. Doctors eventually diagnosed her with a rare neurological condition that affected her mobility. But even in the face of chronic illness, Maryanne never lost her smile. Her determination to live a full life led her to complete high school at a local alternative learning center that specialized in accommodating students with disabilities. Graduating in the mid-1970s was a personal triumph for her and her family, a testament to her grit, patience, and quiet strength. In the years that followed, Maryanne worked with vocational training programs, eventually gaining part-time employment as a receptionist at a community center that offered support services for disabled adults. Although she could not work full-time due to her health, she cherished her job. It allowed her to feel connected to a wider community and to help others like her navigate systems and services. Her small one-bedroom apartment on Hoyt Avenue, which she moved into in 1987, was more than a residence. It was a symbol of independence. Decorated with handmade crafts and soft pastels, the space reflected her personality. Warm, gentle, and inviting. Maryanne's family visited her regularly. Her older sister Sandy helped her with errands, and her brother Terry often drove her to medical appointments. Her niece remembers Maryanne making her laugh with silly jokes and offering heartfelt advice about school and friendships. Though she lived alone, Maryanne was never truly alone. Her heart was intertwined with the lives of those who loved her. What stood out most to those who knew her was her deep trust in people. She had an uncanny ability to find beauty in the world, even after experiencing physical pain, social isolation, and discrimination. She believed in the kindness of strangers, a belief that made her a beacon to some, and tragically, a target to others. It was a Wednesday when Maryanne's sister, Sandy, became worried. She hadn't heard from her since Sunday, and Maryanne hadn't shown up for a scheduled family lunch. Phone calls went unanswered. That concern grew into dread. And later that afternoon, Sandy asked the Everett Police Department to conduct a welfare check. When officers arrived at the apartment on the 2100 block of Hoyt Avenue, they were met with a chilling scene. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Maryanne was found murdered, her body showing signs of sexual assault and multiple stab wounds. She had likely been dead for a day or more. The brutality of the attack shocked even seasoned detectives. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to suspect Maryanne may have known her killer, or that she had trusted them enough to let them in. Nothing significant appeared stolen, and there were no clear motives or suspects. But investigators did recover crucial pieces of physical evidence, including DNA from both the body and a bloodied object believed to be the murder weapon. Unfortunately, in 1989, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The sample was too degraded for conclusive results, and the tools available lacked the precision to create a usable profile. Over the next several years, Maryanne's case would see multiple waves of investigation. Detectives followed leads, re-interviewed neighbors, reviewed case notes, and combed through sex offender registries in the region. But no arrest came. No suspect stood trial. And with each passing year, the chances of solving the case seemed to dwindle. Maryanne's family never gave up. Sandy and Terry continued to contact police every few years, asking for updates, urging them to reopen the case as DNA technology improved. "She wasn't just a case file," Sandy once said. "She was my sister. She was loved." The biological evidence remained preserved, and with each decade came new hope, especially as forensic science leapt forward. In the early 2020s, a new tool began changing the game in cold case investigations: forensic genetic genealogy. Made famous by its role in identifying the Golden State Killer in 2018, this method allows law enforcement to match crime scene DNA to distant relatives of a suspect through open-source genealogy databases. In 2023, Everett detectives partnered with Othram Inc., a Texas-based private lab specializing in cold case DNA analysis. Othram began building a DNA profile from the evidence collected at the scene in 1989. It took months of sequencing, family tree analysis, and genealogical cross-referencing. The DNA profile led them through generations of records, finally narrowing down to one name: Joseph Andrew Jacques. Jacques had once lived in Everett but had long since left Washington. By 2025, he was residing in Las Vegas, Nevada, and had no known criminal record. He had never appeared in Cadiz or been connected to any prior investigations. He was, in every sense, under the radar. But the DNA didn't lie. Investigators quietly tracked him for weeks and obtained a fresh DNA sample. When it came back as a conclusive match to the material left at the scene of Maryanne Daniels' murder, they moved swiftly. On January 25, 2025, authorities arrested Joseph Andrew Jacques without incident in Las Vegas. He now faces extradition to Snohomish County, Washington, where he will stand trial for murder and sexual assault. The news of Jacques' arrest reverberated through the Daniels family and the Everett community. For Maryanne's loved ones, the announcement brought tears. Of sorrow, yes, but also of relief. The person responsible had a name. There would be a trial. There would finally be justice. I appreciate all the hard work and dedication that Detective Logothetti and others put into finding the person who murdered my sister, said Sandy. We've waited so long to say her name out loud with hope. Terry Celine added, This has been a hole in our hearts for 36 years. Maryanne was trusting. That's what we loved about her. And that trust was taken advantage of in the worst way. Local leaders and advocacy groups also responded. The Everett Police Department praised the collaborative effort between their cold case unit and Othram, while community members lit candles at a vigil held near Maryanne's former apartment. Maryanne Daniels' case is the 36th solved in Washington using forensic genealogy. But its significance extends further. It underscores the importance of preserving evidence. It illustrates the life-saving potential of emerging science. And it reaffirms that victims, no matter how long their cases have been cold, are never forgotten. As the case proceeds to trial, many await answers. How did Jacques know Maryanne? Was the attack premeditated? Had he committed other crimes? Only time and courtroom testimony will reveal the rest. Maryanne Daniels never saw the justice she deserved in her lifetime. But her story, once nearly lost in the silence of a forgotten file, now speaks loudly. It speaks of a girl who turned challenges into courage, of a woman who chose love over bitterness, of a family who refused to let time win. Her memory lives on not just in her family's hearts, but now, in the legacy of a solved case, one that proves the past doesn't have to stay buried. Maryanne Daniels was more than a victim. She was a sister, a friend, a fighter. And thanks to the determined pursuit of justice and the miracles of modern science, her voice has finally been heard.